A single stunning injustice put Leah Brown on trial, despite her innocence and years of service to others. John Marshall's actions, driven by suspicion and authority, cast a harsh shadow, fueling outrage in everyone who witnessed the courtroom battle. But when new evidence surfaced, everything turned upside down and exposed the truth for all to see. And just listen to how this gripping drama resolves, as justice finally triumphs. Dust floated, barely visible but ever present, tracing lazy patterns through the beams of sunlight slanting in from windows high on the courtroom wall. The space smelled of polished wood, aging books, and years of nervous sweat absorbed into the grain of bench seats. It was a place built for solemnity, yet on this morning tension ran electric, drawn tight in the hush between each measured step and cautious glance. Leah Brown, seated at the defense table, looked impossibly still. Her posture was careful back straight, hands intertwined, fingertips pressed together as if holding herself in one piece. To anyone watching, her composure might have seemed cold. In reality, it was a fragile shield held against the anxious churn that underlay every breath. The clatter of a gavel at the judge's command halted the last whisperings among spectators. Conversations had crackled all morning. Snippets of speculation, fragments of outrage, muffled concern. Yet now, with the judge's eyes sweeping the room, silence settled like a weight. Leah's attorney, Michael Donovan, leaned into a whisper. 2 short words of reassurance, then returned to his stack of neatly ordered documents. Leah didn't smile. She nodded instead in the tiniest motion, her gaze flicking toward the jury box. 7 faces, varied in age and background, watched her with a mix of curiosity and empathy. Some avoided her eyes, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. Across the aisle, the prosecution readied their case, absorbed in the click-click of a ballpoint pen, rustling papers, and the steady rhythm of legal preparation. The bailiff scanned the room, boots polished and uniform immaculate, practicing neutrality he'd perfected across hundreds of hearings. But today's hearing echoed with a sharper significance. This was no routine proceeding. John Marshall shifted his badge as he entered the witness stand, straightening his posture, smoothing his uniform, flattening creases that weren't there. The soft murmur of spectators faded entirely at his arrival. Marshall, neither flustered nor self-important, took his oath with deliberate calm. He recounted in precise phrases the night in question. An ordinary patrol disrupted by suspicious movement, then a rapidly escalating confrontation. His words painted images shadows cast over side streets, the gleam of headlights reflected in store windows, the sudden sweep of his flashlight catching Leah in motion. He insisted on his adherence to procedure, describing quick decisions made under uncertainty, a raised voice, a flash of movement, mounting adrenaline. He spoke of fear, the kind that makes seconds stretch into feeling like hours. In his retelling, it was just another night where threat and confusion rode close together. There was no anger when he spoke, but neither was there remorse. Leah did not interrupt, her silence sharper than any rebuttal. She listened, balanced somewhere between defending herself and observing the man who held so much sway over her fate and reputation. The courtroom focused in unison, every gesture, every pause magnified by dire implication. Michael Donovan's preparation was relentless. His fingers traced the edges of police records, shuffling through evidence maps, photos, timelines. He caught Leah's eye once, allowing her the brief comfort that someone understood. He was her anchor, calm, measured, and determined. Behind closed lips and a tightening jaw, he readied his first line of questioning, organizing facts that would soon challenge the narrative taking shape. As Marshall narrated the moments before and after the incident, each word seemed to hang in the air long after it was spoken. What triggered the decision to fire? Was it a threat or fear become self-fulfilling prophecy? These questions were not answered directly, and the silence after his testimony was thick with anticipation. The judge, level and precise, took notes, prepared to navigate the knots of truth and perception that courts so often wrestle. Outside the windows, life continued. Traffic flowed. Leaves danced in the breeze. Distant car horns signaled another ordinary day. Inside the courtroom, the world felt narrowed to the tension between two people whose stories would soon be weighed in the scales of justice. The opening chapter had laid bare the setting, the stakes, and the chilled hush of waiting. The battle for truth and vindication, wound tightly through the words and silences of that first day, had begun. Morning light had given way to the softer glow of afternoon, casting the courtroom in muted gold. The energy in the room had shifted from anticipatory hush to a deeper gravity as Michael Donovan prepared to guide the jury through the tangled truth of Leah Brown's story. He stood for a moment in silence, letting the tension settle around him, every movement slow and considered, a conscious effort to create space for empathy in a chamber so often ruled by strict procedure. He began by returning, with patient detail, to the night that changed everything. The jury listened as he described Leah's routine, the familiar bus stop, her walk along the same route taken since childhood, her commitment to the late shift at the pediatric clinic. Michael reminded them of Leah's responsibilities, not just to her patients, but to the grandmother she cared for, to the neighborhood kids she'd taught to read, to the community that quietly depended on her kindness. Each anecdote was delivered with the soft focus of memory, letting jurors see Leah not as a defendant, but as a neighbor, friend, and daughter. Michael's voice lowered as he turned to the events captured on the marred surveillance video. He painted what little could be seen. Leah stepping carefully out of the drizzle, her coat gathered tightly about her, a bag of groceries visible in her arms. The video's grainy frames flickered through gaps. A streetlight glare, the uncertain approach of headlights, Leah pausing as a police cruiser rolled to a stop. Michael did not embellish, choosing instead to dwell in the ambiguity, drawing attention to Leah's cautious gait, the absence of aggression, the simple fear in her posture when the confrontation began. When the video faltered, stuttering into static at the worst possible moment, Michael's frustration was palpable, but he channeled that disappointment into a gentle narration of what was unseen, what Leah remembered, what she tried desperately to convey that night. He spoke of her voice, steady but trembling, as she answered John Marshall's commands. She repeated again and again, he told the jury, that she was unarmed and only wanted to go home. These were not words of defiance, but of someone hoping for understanding amidst confusion and suspicion. The questions Michael posed next were quiet, yet piercing. He asked the jury to consider what Leah must have felt, confronted unexpectedly in the rain, the confusion of harsh lights and raised voices, the sudden weight of fear. He drew out the contrast between the official record and Leah's life outside the courtroom, allowing the humanity of her habits and relationships to seep into the deliberative mind of each juror. One by one, witnesses from Leah's world were called. Her supervisor described Leah's reliability, her calm during emergencies, and her instinct to help rather than confront. A neighbor recounted evenings when Leah brought groceries to elderly tenants, sometimes going without herself to ensure others had enough. Even a childhood friend, her eyes brimming with tears, spoke of Leah's unwavering kindness, the sense that she always put others before herself. Michael concluded by asking Leah to speak. Her voice, hesitant at first, carried across the courtroom, wavering only when she described her thoughts that night. She recounted the shock and disbelief, her fear for her own safety, her efforts to be understood by the officer she could barely see through the glare of the cruiser's lights. She did not cry, but her pain showed in every pause and shallow intake of breath. Her account was not polished or dramatic. It was an account of confusion and desperate hope for recognition, her words simple and authentic. Around the room, emotions shifted with every sentence. Leah's mother watched, unable to hide the anguish in her tightly clasped hands. Even those who tried to maintain professional detachment, jurors, lawyers, the judge himself, felt the tide of empathy rising. The weight of Leah's vulnerability and resilience filled the space, leaving an unspoken challenge, to see her not as a shadowy figure in a legal drama, but as a person struggling against odds, fighting to reclaim her voice and her truth. As Michael returned to his seat, the courtroom held its breath, transformed by a narrative that transcended accusation and defense. What remained was a sense of shared humanity, the silent understanding that beneath the surface of every trial are the lives and sorrows of real people searching for justice and grace. The next morning arrived heavy with anticipation. The courthouse steps bustled with reporters and bystanders trading fragments of rumor, their faces marked by impatience and curiosity. Inside the courtroom, though, the mood was far sharper drawn, tight as a wire, charged with a rising current of unease. Whispers moved through the rows of onlookers, and every seat was filled well before the session began. As proceedings resumed, Michael Donovan's approach shifted. The air trembled with the expectation of conflict. He rose from his seat with deliberation, papers in hand, and surveyed the room before calling the next witness, a figure whose testimony would cut through the muddied recounting of facts. Raymond Garner, a retired teacher and longtime resident of the neighborhood, entered slowly, his presence carrying a quiet dignity. He walked with the careful precision of someone shouldering responsibility, his every movement a reminder of the seriousness of this day. Raymond settled into the witness stand, hands folded in his lap, eyes brushing across the faces before him. Michael greeted him gently, then began with simple, unobtrusive questions. How long had Raymond known Leah? What did he see on the night in question? Each answer came measured and clear, Raymond's voice steady, but infused with emotion. He described what he understood as routine. A walk home interrupted by the sudden intrusion of flashing lights and the unmistakable tension that can fill a street in an instant. His testimony unfolded like a slow reveal. He recounted the sound of voices rising in confusion, Leah's startled reaction, and the officer's sharp commands. Raymond made no grand claims but noted the lack of any aggressive gesture from Leah. What struck him, he said, was her distress, a visible fear rather than belligerence, a plea instead of a threat. Michael pressed for details, mindful of the need for nuance and clarity. The room's attention was absolute. Even minor points, the time, the angle of view from Raymond's porch, ambient noises on the street were considered with care. Several jurors leaned forward, one scribbling notes, another pinching the bridge of his nose in concentration. The prosecution, by contrast, showed subtle signs of strain. Their efforts to redirect were polite but hollow, unable to shake Raymond's calm. As Raymond continued, the tone of the courtroom shifted from inquiry to indignation. Those present were gripped by an increasing sense that something was amiss. The judge listened with the gravity of someone weighing more than legal arguments. His gaze lingered on Leah, on Raymond, and occasionally on the officer whose testimony had introduced the morning's tension. The emotional intensity mounted as Michael revealed inconsistencies in the official account. Questions did not accuse, but illuminated. Why had crucial evidence been lost or damaged? Why did Leah's pleas go unheard? Michael's voice rose, not with anger, but with urgency and resolve. These moments were engineered to challenge the system itself, to expose the gaps through which injustice might slip. Raymond's testimony reached its peak as he spoke of Leah's resilience. He described her efforts to remain composed despite fear, her measured attempts to explain herself, and the frustration of watching those attempts dissolve into misunderstanding. His voice caught slightly, not with accusation, but with sorrow, a shared grief over the ease with which suspicion can cloud judgment. In the gallery, emotion simmered close to the surface. Friends squeezed each other's hands, some eyes shone with unshed tears, and the tension was almost palpable. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed the mounting frustration, mirroring the struggle to reconcile facts with personal conviction. As testimony ended, Michael thanked Raymond quietly, and the witness retired with the quiet dignity he had brought to the stand. In that moment, the courtroom felt transformed, a crucible where doubt had given way to collective indignation. The proceedings no longer revolved solely around questions of evidence or law, but around the very nature of fairness and compassion. The judge called a brief recess. Jurors returned to their chambers with furrowed brows and restless energy, weighed down by the seriousness of what they had heard. Raymond Garner's account echoed in every corner. The ordinary day outside seemed impossibly distant. The chapter closed with the sense that the narrative had reached a critical turning point. The wave of emotion, sympathy, outrage, and determination would shape the course of everything that came next. The battle for truth, sharpened by testimony and revealed fact, was now the central force driving the room toward its inevitable confrontation. Afternoon faded into early evening, casting a hush that was thicker and heavier than at any point before. The courthouse, usually echoing with brisk footsteps and the drone of routine hearings, held a thrumming silence. Word of the morning's revelations had swept through the corridors, drawing more faces to the gallery, some with notebooks, many more with anxious hope or restless indignation. The air itself felt electric, tight with the unspoken certainty that everything could change before nightfall. As the judge called the room to order, Michael Donovan sat poised, his hands resting atop a folder marked critical evidence. He hadn't rushed through the recess. Instead, he'd paced the hallway, recalling every promise made to Leah, that the truth, no matter how obscured by doubt or error, could find its way into daylight. He studied her in these final moments before the storm. Leah held stillness with newfound strength, her gaze forward, her composure not untouched by fear, but fortified now by the testimony and compassion she'd been shown. Returning to the defense table, Michael nodded once. The next and perhaps final round in the courtroom battle was set into motion by the quietest of signals. At his request, a court technician prepared to play an audio recording, the quality scratchy, but the contents unmistakably authentic. The judge adjusted his glasses, signaling for calm. As the first seconds of the recording spilled into the room, every person stilled, breaths held, pens stilled over pads, even the bailiff's routine vigilance stilled by anticipation. The tape played the muffled rhythm of rain and city noise, interrupted only by two urgent voices. Leah's, pleading for understanding, and John Marshall's, tense and elevated, issuing warnings. The clarity of emotion was undeniable. Even distorted by the recording's imperfections, it resonated with everyone present. A tremor seemed to ripple through the courtroom as Marshall's threat became audible, the moments before the shots marked not by chaos, but by chilling certainty and misunderstanding. This evidence, simple in its delivery but shattering in its impact, redrew the entire landscape of the trial. Michael offered no dramatics, letting the recording speak for itself. A collective murmur rose sharp, questioning, indignant, until the judge called for silence once more, his gavel a plea for order over passion. On the prosecution's side, faces flushed with shock, their earlier confidence wavering now in the face of the undeniable. In this critical moment, Michael stood. He addressed the jury with the calm certainty of someone not simply seeking victory, but of someone demanding fairness. His words did not accuse. They invited reflection, empathy, and responsibility. He asked jurors to weigh not just law and fact, but the fullness of the human drama set before them. He reminded them of Leah's journey, not as a defendant, but as a person who had survived fear, public scrutiny, and staggering doubt, only to reach the threshold of justice. Leah's courage was now visible to all. In the gallery, strangers leaned forward, compelled not by spectacle, but by her authenticity. Her mother's silent tears glistened in the low light, while friends exchanged wordless looks of hope and relief. Even those who had doubted now found reason to reconsider, drawn by the moral clarity of the moment. Whispers rang through the spectators' words of support, disbelief, promises to remember this day and what it would mean for their community. The judge took time to gather his thoughts, and then, in a voice steady but edged with emotion, he instructed the jury to deliberate with care. Each member retreated into a silence deepened by the gravity of choice. For long minutes the courtroom waited, suspended on the line between anticipation and dread. Old clocks ticked with unusual resonance. Outside, the world kept moving, buses idling, laughter spilling from distant parks. But inside, time seemed to wait, holding its breath for justice. When the jury at last returned, their verdict fell upon the room like sudden rain after a heavy drought. Leah Brown was cleared of wrongdoing. The courtroom's reaction was spontaneous, a swell of voices, some tearful, some exuberant, all bound together by a sense of relief and catharsis. The judge's call for decorum could not quiet the celebration. Leah's supporters surged to embrace her, and even Michael, so composed throughout, allowed a rare smile to break across his face. Yet as security stepped forward to escort John Marshall from the room pending review, a hush fell this time, one born of reckoning. The narrative had turned. Those present would not let the memory of what they'd witnessed fade. Their cheers and applause left a legacy, an implicit promise to tell this story until every voice, even the quietest, could be heard. Leah stood now at the center of the room, transformed. She was no longer simply someone judged or defended. She was a survivor, vindicated not just by law, but by the empathy and determination of an entire community. Reporters scrambled to record every detail. Voices echoed down marble hallways, and yet amid the pandemonium, Leah felt a weight lift from her shoulders, replaced by gratitude and humble pride. Outside, as evening settled and the sky deepened, people flowed from the courthouse, taking with them not just the details of the verdict, but a renewed sense of what justice could look like. Leah paused on the steps, her eyes reflecting the city's lights, and finally allowed herself a moment of peace. The day had begun in tension and uncertainty, but closed with a resounding affirmation. Truth, patience, and compassion could indeed overcome even the most tangled trials, and in the memory of those who witnessed it, this story, a story of courage, dignity, and the complicated pursuit of fairness would linger, quietly shaping the world they stepped back into.